Thank you, Richard. As usual, you're far too gracious, and man, am I glad that you, I don't know if you realize this, but in proper Mormon fashion, that you put my name on the preliminary schedule for this before I had actually formally accepted. I'd sent an email after the invitation saying, I'll think about that, see if I can, and the next thing I knew, I had an email with my name advertised on. So, if you're going to have your arm twisted and then you show up and somebody says such nice things about you, then, well, that's good by me. I just want to say thank you to Richard, to Claudia, to Glenn, to Laura, to Sharon Harris as well, all the folks who have been associated with putting this together and making it work. I'm very, very pleased to be here. On January 7th, 1836, there was a gathering at Bishop Newell Whitney's home in Kirtland, Ohio. As Joseph Smith described it in his journal, our meeting was opened by singing and prayer offered up by Father Smith, after which Bishop Whitney's father and mother were blessed, and a number of others with a patriarchal blessing. We then received a bountiful refreshment, furnished by the liberality of the bishop. The company was large. Before we parted, we had some of the songs of Zion sung, and our hearts were made glad, while partaking of an anticipation of those joys that will be poured upon the head of the saints when they are gathered together on Mount Zion to enjoy each other's society forever, more even all the blessings of heaven and earth, and where there will be none to molest nor make us afraid. And I have to note here that this Joseph Smith's splendid spelling, right? Anticipation is spelled antipast, A-N-T-I-P-A-S-T. I think he was really thinking about the food. It's like antipast, the meat and cheese came to mind. That's what he was really savoring about this occasion. As Richard Bushman glosses the episode, here was a plain man's dream, a feast and genial companionship, safe from enemies. Yet, as Bushman notes, Joseph Smith made a stronger claim for what might otherwise be regarded as an unremarkable, if pleasant, scene of domestic happiness. Because of the liberality, to use his word, characterizing the occasion, the diversity of the congregation, the generosity of the refreshment, the fullness of good feeling, welling up out of good society, Smith pronounced this sumptuous feast, he spelled sumptuous right, to be, quote, after the order of the Son of God, end quote. Smith's gesture, I want to say, highlights something arguably essential about Mormonism, that Mormonism is a dare, a triple dog dare. The skeptical, provoking question behind which might be stated thusly: in a secular age, as Charles Taylor has dubbed it, in which increasingly enchantment cannot be unself-consciously experienced, but must be self-consciously considered, explained, and defended as a claim, how can a dinner party of all things, amongst a ragtag bunch of self-selected oddballs on a January night on the Ohio frontier, how can that be made sacred in an effectual, meaningful, motivating, organizing way? At precisely the moment the sense of the sacred has been subjected to, the story goes, unprecedented levels of scrutiny, to an unparalleled burden of demonstration and justification, a moment when disbelief is becoming a viable and indeed respectable option, where does Joseph Smith get off, so confidently crafting a sense of the sacred so entire as to include, dubiously sumptuous spreads, and a sense of the sacred so evidently compelling, not only to have prompted Whitney, Smith's journal reports, to reprise the repast a couple of days later, but, stating the obvious, to have brought all of us here to this room 181 years later, where I think we can savor this story with knowing smiles. What Joseph Smith possessed was the audacity and virtuosity to make things sacred, or to use our Mormon term of art, to consecrate. Under unpropitious conditions, when prevailing senses of the sacred were being fundamentally challenged and circumscribed in new ways. Indeed, Mormonism as a whole, I want to say today, might be understood as first and foremost what I will call an art of consecration. That is, a bravura show of skill at making things sacred by making unlikely things sacred in less than auspicious contexts. Think no farther than Smith's rhapsodic retrospective on the Restoration, canonized as Doctrine and Covenants 128. The voice of Peter, James, and John in the wilderness between Harmony, Susquehanna County, and Colesville, Broome County, on the Susquehanna River, declaring themselves as possessing the keys of the kingdom and of the dispensation of the fullness of times. The voice of God in the chamber of old Father Whitmer in Fayette, Seneca County. Theophany and toponymy together, the milestones of dispensational history delineated within the milestones demarcating arbitrary units of territorial administration, the county lines. Richard Hughes, Jan Shipps, and others have suggested Joseph Smith ventured to envelop himself and his followers in an unfolding cosmic drama in a manner that quickly overflowed the established channels of Christian primitivism. Kathleen Flake puts a nice point on it. Quote, Luther nailed his complaints to the door, and the church fathers countered with decrees of anathema. In such exchanges of creedal statement and dogmatic restatement, most of modern Christianity has formed and reformed itself. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, wrote stories, however. And more than that, I'd add inhabited and enacted stories. One way of understanding this historical phenomenon would be to highlight what Harold Bloom called the religion-making imagination of Joseph Smith. And certainly some of the most interesting moments in the early Mormon corpus are when, so to speak, we are shown how the sausage is made even as it's being made. For instance, in the lectures on faith that originally furnished the doctrine in the Doctrine and Covenants, and in which Smith had some substantive authorial, editorial, and pedagogical role, take this. Let us here observe that a religion that does not require the sacrifice of all things never has power sufficient to produce the faith necessary unto life and salvation. So what's happening here? Here in the context of outlining the doctrine of what might be called a new religion, we get a second-order reflection on how this thing called religion itself works, and thus a subordination of this new religion's imminent articulation of its doctrine to a larger philosophy of religion. In other words, a sincere faith statement is to some extent being mediated through a dispassionate theoretical understanding of how something called religion functions. The cool analytical question the passage is asking might be phrased as, what makes a religion succeed? But what is intriguing is that this passage is at the same time answering that question in the obviously interested and impassioned form of announcing and enunciating Mormonism with its properly calibrated dose of sacrifice. One might break down the rhetorical thrust here thusly. How does a religion succeed? Watch and learn, you sons of bishops. So, there you go. You're welcome for putting it decorously. So, in this reading, the operative words in Bloom's phrase, religion-making imagination, are making and imagination rather than religion. What stands out is not so much the religion Smith makes as the frankness and flair with which he is making. To this point, one might further register that the very concept of religion, as Talal Asad and others have shown us, emerges in a secular age in large part as a tool whereby imperial states discipline the experience and expression of belief into forms that are compatible with their own authority. That which is called religion is to some extent dignified, yes, but only insofar as it is specified as a largely private affair unfolding in disestablished churches and disembodied minds. Which is to say that given the political trouble that the early Mormon movement consistently found itself in, it's not at all clear to me that what Smith and early Mormons created is best described as a religion. Indeed, the measure of a proper Mormon cultural nationalism, if you will, which we all ought to have some measure of, I think, might be precisely an unwillingness to be content with Mormonism's classification as a mere religion. My contention on all this is that apart from the question of what exactly it was that he made, Joseph Smith above all was, to use contemporary parlance, a maker, a maestro maker. And as this passage suggests, religion, a distinct object that was subject to the vagaries of his making. Following this line, we might play at defining Joseph Smith and Mormonism under the rubric of another term like religion that achieved a new singularity and independence in a secular age: art. And Christine just gave a very impressive sort of sketch of the sort of the history, through which that term sort of split off and became an autonomous category, and I'm going to touch on that as well here. All you have to do is, we could just get in we need a few buses and zip down to the Met, right? And you would readily cognize, I think, the arbitrariness of this distinction, right, between art and other categories like religion, right? You could just simply note any number of originally devotional objects on display as art. A practice, it should be said, it should be mentioned, that is strongly objected to by any number of groups who claim those objects as their spiritual or cultural patrimony. In fact, the emergence of religion and art as discrete categories can be narrated as a single story. Not coincidentally, in the Romantic era in which Joseph Smith and early Mormonism emerged, a range of figures developed modern aesthetic theory and practice as we still know it in many ways. And they did so primarily as a tactic for retaining or rehabilitating some sense of the spiritual, we'll say. And they were doing so in the face of certain currents of Enlightenment materialism, a leading edge of which was the so-called higher criticism of the Bible, which drew on newly available and ever-accumulating textual and extra-textual evidence to expose the Bible as a human document. Johann Gottfried Herder, Friedrich Schleiermacher, the Schlegel brothers, and many other properly Teutonic-sounding folks, most of whom identified as Christian, and some of whom were clergy, increasingly pointed to the literary richness of the Bible and other sacred texts and performances as the sure sign of the divine moving through human history, right? So as certain edifices of doctrine and authority sort of eroded, as a certain set of sort of supernaturalist claims about the Bible began to be called into question, they turned to the literary merit of the Bible as a sign of why it was a vital document that human beings should live their lives under to some extent. To put it far too reductively, the destabilization of the prophetic provoked an elevation of the poetic in order to shore up the authority and the felt sense of value deposited in certain texts and traditions. And there were undeniable concessions involved in this move, not insignificantly a surrender of orthodoxy, by which I here mean a self-serious and mobilizing commitment to the rightness of a particular doctrinal content. And a story can be told, and indeed has been told frequently, in which the vanishing point of such a liberalization of Christianity is the vanishing of congregants from church pews, right? That in effect, the liberalization of Christianity is indistinguishable from a certain understanding of secularization. But this swerve to the aesthetic, at the outermost limits of its ripple effect, also offered breathtaking inducements to sacralize as never before. If, as Herder had modeled, one could, through an empathetic exercise of historical imagination, show how Hebrew poetry represented the transit of absolute spirit through the spirit of a particular people in a particular age. The question was, could you reverse engineer the process? Was this process exclusively retrospective, or could it be prospective? Could one figure out a way to cultivate requisite sensitivities to the spirit of one's own people in this age, right now, in order to create something that some might call art, that attested to or even summoned the divine presence. And again, Christine's quotation and reflection on Steiner's essay on aesthetics is useful here. Is there a sense in which art is, art, it has to be in scare quotes, right, always has at the heart of it some sort of sacralizing aspiration. If past evidence of the divine inhered in human aesthetic achievement, to what extent could human aesthetic achievement conjure the divine in the present? Could poets replace priests? How would one do that? What would it look like? William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Friedrich Hölderlin, Walt Whitman, and many others in this period seem to have been incited by such questions. What I mean to underscore here is that the aspiration embedded in the aesthetic, even as it shakes loose from religion or spirituality into its nominal autonomy, is consecration. The modern aesthetic was born not merely to reconstitute some sanctity for particular long-standing objects of reverence, like the Bible, but by it was born the possibility of generating in and with the juddering flows of history new sacred objects. Now, this possibility is admittedly a fragile and a fraught one, but no less persistent and vital. In light of the historical particulars I've just sketched, the modern aesthetic often suffers from a kind of replacement anxiety, we'll say, right? Big shoes to fill, right? As the distinction between something called art and something being called religion is made increasingly plausible through various forms of institutional realization and ideological recrimination, a set of creative expressions that might be provisionally distinguished as art loses its nerve, so to speak. Hence, in the work of a preeminent post-romantic aesthetician like Matthew Arnold, one notes both a bold nomination of culture, which he intends in its sort of non-anthropological sense as a certain measure of aesthetic achievement, his famous phrase, the best which has been thought and said, right? So on the one hand, Arnold is sort of putting forward culture, right, high aesthetic achievement, as a spiritual salve for alienated moderns. But at the same time, right, there's also everywhere afoot a terrified misgiving that the withdrawal of what he in his most famous lines called the sea of faith has left us irredeemable in a nightmare world. One perhaps detects a subtler schizophrenia in Amy Hungerford's recent discussion of modernist and postmodern literature of the 20th and 21st centuries. On the one hand, she recognizes how these texts often seem compelled by questions of belief in ways that would seem to run athwart familiar secularization narratives that describe or prescribe the world's inevitable disenchantment. On the other hand, she somewhat blunts the force of this claim by characterizing these texts as primarily fascinated by belief without content, as she puts it. That is, belief as a passing phenomenon and intriguing subjective state. The replacement anxiety of the modern aesthetic can also express itself in a formidable repression of the spiritual animus that we have seen initially propelled it forward. In this scheme, the emergence of the aesthetic as a discrete category of experience and understanding is seen as integral to, even indistinguishable from, the historical process of secularization. To apprehend and appreciate an object in aesthetic terms, that is to recognize and regard it as an artifice productive of discernible and describable effects, is ultimately to disenchant it in a certain way, to deprive it of the overwhelming power typically associated with the religious or the spiritual. Call it the Wizard of Oz effect or something, pulling of the curtain, right? On this model, the aesthetic object offers its own enjoyments, to be sure, and substantial ones, but these are understood as distinct from, and at times even at odds with, the feelings aroused by the religious or the spiritual. Imagine the specific kind of pleasures afforded the clever novelist who plants a portentous allusion or extravagant metaphor drawn from a religious tradition at a crucial juncture in the text, and the astute reader who catches the reference. In one recent iteration of this aestheticization as secularization thesis, the rise of fictionality, as evidenced by the success of the novel as a cultural form in the 18th and 19th centuries, is made to mark the ascent towards secular modernity. To be a secular modern, this scholar argues, is precisely to have developed the ironic sensibility that allows one to perceive and receive a story that achieves verisimilitude, that is, some sort of likeness to reality, as a mere fiction, an object in relation to which one winkingly, temporarily suspends disbelief, but not in which one, in any sense, believes. And here is one among many moments where the Book of Mormon becomes very interesting, right? That a text that emerges in the 19th century in the sort of heyday of the American romance, as it was called, a certain sort of strain of the novel. Its tagline could be, it is the historical romance that people actually end up believing in, right? So aesthetic autonomy, here signified both by the massive influence attributed to a literary form, the novel, and the worldly habits of mind allegedly inculcated by that form, spells the end of certain prospects for belief which are discredited as naive. Beneath these various expressions of the modern aesthetic's replacement anxiety is a concession of human making in the broadest sense to the secular, and a surrender of the possibility that things can be made robustly sacred, authentically and widely consecrated. This, I'm saying, is on a deep level a betrayal of the highest hope carried by the aesthetic in modernity, a quailing at the triple dog dare that I see Mormonism as taking on. So how does Mormonism avoid making this concession? Perhaps because this concession seems to be predicated, consciously or not, on a dualistic ontology of divine creation that Mormonism, in some of its strains, at least explicitly and emphatically rejects. Let me explain a bit about that dualistic ontology of divine creation. For those, like the Christian novelist Marilyn Robinson, who find ways in a secular age to maintain a theistic position, that is, a belief in a certain sort of God, whatever human beings create constitutes a second creation that asks to be compared to and contextualized within a first creation authored by a sovereign God. So human making can only be fully valorized insofar as it is perceived to reverberate within and thereby amplify the first divine creation. Human making, we might say then, is thus typically secular and becomes something more only when it manages to tap into a transcendent givenness. Put another way, human beings can't make anything sacred. They can only reveal something always already sacred because divinely made. By the same token, for those who find themselves within the imminent frame of a secular age, unable or unwilling for understandable reasons to claim access to the transcendent, then human making is secular either by default, transcendental reference is just deemed unavailable, or as a defiant gesture. Right? Think of Marx's foundation-shaking assertion that the objective of the most strenuous human thought and activity ought to be the revolutionary transformation of material reality toward maximal human flourishing. The echo chamber here is constituted by the human rather than the divine. What humans make is by humans and is or should be for humans alone. But Mormonism arguably proceeds from different premises, at least in certain moods. Joseph Smith dismissed creation ex nihilo, and with it an ontological dualism that positioned the human and the divine on either side of a gaping gap. He pictured a cosmos uniformly made of matter, attaining different degrees of organization relative to their suffusion by intelligence. The game would thus seem to be configuring matter in ways that concentrate intelligence, creating assemblages on various scales that exponentially multiply intelligence, magnifying it into superintelligence. In other words, we might say, making objects sacred. How better to understand Joseph Smith's seer stones or golden plates or the living body of saints that follows in his train? To be a prophet or a god for that matter is simply to have gotten really good at generating a sense of the sacred through a soulful and searching constellation of objects. This may be the ultimate manifestation of what I mean when I call Mormonism an art of consecration, a skillful practice, a honed expertise at putting things together in ways that spark. I might now venture with greater precision that Mormonism, historically speaking, might be construed as avant-garde art, insofar as consecration is understood to be the highest hope vested in the modern aesthetic. If Mormonism itself is already art, then Mormon art in a way is a redundancy. Put another way, art that understands itself or aspires to be Mormon in some authentic way might envision its task as that of Mormonism itself, as I've described it. Practicing art in extremis, art at its most mad and ambitious, where it dares in the teeth of the secular age to try to generate a sense of the sacred, to ask what the sacred is in the first place, and to what extent it remains possible, and to cultivate those possibilities, however small or strange they may be. Technically speaking, this may involve further turns away from the representational and toward the conceptual, the performative, the interactive. Some of the Mormon art I most admire, some of which I'm happy to say is on display here, is already doing this in provocative ways. Paige Turner's meticulous, quasi-infinite concatenations of seemingly mundane minutiae made and found, she has herself described in the pages of Exponent 2, which deserves a big shout out for discovering and featuring Mormon women artists. Paige describes this as her work as turning scraps, particularly those left by and for women, into sacred objects. As a viewer and proud owner of her works, I can attest to its successful transmission to me and my wife Amy, at least, of all those bosom burnings and mind quickenings Mormons have been taught attend the presence of the divine. Also in Exponent 2, Rachel Farmer has characterized her elegant pioneer figurines as ancestor spirits, representations in which time and space are collapsed, objects offering the living a therapeutic reckoning with the dead, to whom, for better and worse, we owe our very being. In Farmer's account, these objects even attain a kind of fetishistic quality, insofar as they effectively externalize one's deepest wishes and worries, including one's greatest qualms about the Mormon tradition, and thus facilitate self-revelation and transformation. I also think of Joe Benyon's exquisite pottery, sold from his shop in the picture-perfect pioneer town of Spring City, Utah, which is fired in a hand-built kiln on which is inscribed, if you steal a peek, as I have, the words, "Holiness to the Lord." When I eat off Benyon's plates, the food tastes as good as Joseph Smith said the truth ought to. I feel health in my navel and marrow in my bones. Any such meal, even rat vomit, is indeed after the order of the Son of God, to use Smith's terms. So here now, gracefully surrounded by and thoughtfully attending to such work, it only seems fitting, I think, to pronounce this occasion after the order of the Son of God, or whatever consecrating formula you prefer. And what I hope to have conveyed in the end, in my title, Mormonism or Art All the Way Down, is that this sort of pronouncement could be seen as just a way of acknowledging that this experience right now, and the Mormon experience writ large, might be regarded as occurring within an ongoing interactive art installation set in motion by Joseph Smith and the ancestor spirits, without whom we cannot be made perfect. Thank you.